JT Cruel, and you're watching Invest Comics TV.
The Batman history with you, of course, Bob Kane and some of the others who started out with it, created a mythos that you have virtually perfected. And, of course, it's moved on into the Dark Knight movies and even Batman Beyond and a whole bunch of other iterations that have grown out of the original character.
Right.
But one of the most controversial things, if I can get into that, that you did or contributed to, you didn't write it, I don't think, was the Green Arrow, Green Lantern drug issue.
I had a little bit to do with it on the writing end. I did not write the issues, but in those days I don't know if you need a little backstory, but essentially we were doing the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series as essentially just to get our creative juices going. Denny O'Neil and I come from a similar generation. Denny was a newspaper reporter, and I was a pain in the ass. Two very similar professions.
Yes.
And I wanted to do Green Lantern because Gil Kane had done Green Lantern, and now he was no longer doing it, and it was being handed out to anybody who came along, and was selling so badly that they were going to cancel it. And so I went to the editor and I said, I'd like to do Green Lantern. And he said, get the hell out of my office. After a couple more visits to his office, he said, you're serious? I said, yeah, I'd love to do Green Lantern. He said, why? He said, because Gil Kane did it, and I love Gil Kane's work, and I'd like to do Green Lantern because of that. So he talked to Denny O'Neil, talked to Carmine Infantino, who was the creative director at DC Comics, talked to Denny about writing it. And what I had done in a Brave and Bold is I had sort of reintroduced Green Arrow in a new costume and a new iteration, as you so nicely phrased it, so that although he appeared in one story very briefly, people loved it. People just loved that Green Arrow that I did in Brave and Bold, and nobody knew what to do with it. So Julie thought, well, why don't we put him with Green Lantern, and we'll have Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And he proposed that idea, suggested it to me, and I said, that's probably the dumbest idea I've ever heard. It's like Green Lantern, Green Arrow. I mean, what is this, a convention of people with green in their names? Although it was stupid, and I have followed it up with many other stupid ideas, the personalities of the characters did seem to appeal to Denny O'Neil and Julie, and I guess to myself. And so we started to do a series of comic books, and those series of comic books were considered to be, and were called relevant comics, because we talked about stuff, black people. Issues of the day, significant issues of the day. And Denny had some opinions in those days about things like the Chicago 7 trials and other stuff like that. I had some opinions. They weren't quite as political as that, but they definitely had to do with humanitarian issues. So we managed to get into that very heavily. But we were sort of pissing our way to the end of it, and there were just so many issues you could tackle in comic books. And Denny was attacking the idea of overpopulation, which seemed to be kind of an iffy question at that time. And I'm thinking, well, overpopulation, first of all, I'm drawing too many people, which is really a pain in the ass. But second of all, we're kind of running out of issues. And I thought, you know what, we're running out of issues, but we still haven't done anything on drug addiction. Now, Denny and I had been both contacted by DC Comics in the city of New York with the possibility of doing a drug comic that could be handed out at the various drug institutes. Denny O'Neil and I wrote outlines for such a comic book, and both of them were rejected because we didn't have quite the conservative approach that everybody else had. We said, maybe it's schools and parents that are responsible, not quite so much the kids who do drugs, because you know what? It's more fun than not. And second of all, what the hell else are you going to get if you're a teenager and dad comes home, opens his whiskey and sits in front of the television and enjoys his evening while you go off and do your homework for 3 hours? Sometimes that bothers kids. And so we kind of implied that maybe it was everybody's responsibility and maybe everybody ought to do something about it, not just point at the kids and tell them just say no.
Here's a riddle for you. What do the California gold rush of the 1850s, secret societies, coded messages, mysterious 19th century flying machines, and an early 20th century outside artist named Charles A. Delshaw all have in common? The Secrets of Delshaw by Dennis Crenshaw and Pete Navarro. Go to www.secretsofdelshaw.com to learn more.
So they rejected our outlines, but we were sort of like left with, this kind of unresolved issue. And I thought, I was at that time the president of our neighborhood drug association. We had opened in the Bronx, a nunnery had been turned into a drug rehabilitation center, and the community got all upset. And I went to a meeting. And in the end, I became the president of the association, the neighborhood association, to integrate the drug programs into the neighborhood without screwing up the neighborhood. And, I'd go down and I'd help, guys with runny noses hanging out on 42nd Street back to the Institute and drag them in and feed them coffee and stuff. And I was kind of involved in the whole process. And so I went home and I thought, I don't want to miss this drug thing. So I did a cover that had Speedy having just shot up, sitting at a table in an apartment with Green Lantern and Green Arrow behind them, and Green Lantern saying, see, you're such a big hotshot liberal. Here's your ward. They called them wards in those days. Here's your ward, a drug addict. And, of course, Green Arrow, the high-flying liberal, was shocked and aghast. And I took that cover, I penciled it, and I lettered it, and I inked it, and I took it into my editor. And he dropped it like a hot potato and said, we can't do this. And I said, yeah, but we ought to do it. And he said, we're never going to do this, Neal. You're out of your mind. We have the comics code. Then I showed it to everybody at DC Comics, and they all, tried to get their hands off it as quick as possible because it burnt. Anyway, everybody, first they said, we're not going to pay you for this. I said, well, I understand you're not going to pay me for it. I'm not asking to be paid for it. I just think we ought to do this book. Okay, you're out of your mind. We know who you are, Neal. You're one of the nuts. So goodbye. I went over to Marvel Comics just to hang out one day, and I talked to Johnny Romita, and Johnny Romita showed me this Spider-Man comic book that Stan had written, and Johnny had drawn, where a character had walked off a roof because he was popping pills. I am not aware of anybody, quote, popping pills and walking off a roof, but I thought it was an interesting stab at in the Stan Lee genre of talking about drug addiction. So I said, what's going to happen with the book, Johnny? Johnny said, I don't know. I have no idea. But the comics code said they're not going to, we can't do it. I said, so what has Stan decided to do? I mean, what's going to happen? And he said, well, Stan said he went to his uncle, who was the publisher, and his uncle said, do whatever you want. And Stan decided to run the book without the comics code seal. And so I went back a couple of weeks later after the book had come out. I went to see Johnny, and I said, what happened with the Spider-Man book? He said, nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? He said, well, we haven't gotten a letter. Nobody even noticed the comics code seal wasn't there. Nobody has said anything. We have no letters, nothing from anybody. I said, no kidding.
Wow.
Well, I went over to DC DC Comics, and that the shit had hit the fan. They already had this cover, and Stan had aced them.
Yes.
Beat the hell out of them. So here they were with this cover. Well, let me just tell you, the Comics Code Authority was owned and run by the comic book publishers. It wasn't an outside organization. They decided to police themselves.
Right.
So they got together within the next week, and 2 weeks later, maybe 3, the Comics Code was rewritten from top to bottom.
Wow.
And it was presented to my editor, Julie Schwartz, and he said, I guess we're going to do that comic book. And we did.
Cool.
It turned out to be a 2-parter.
So you had half a hand in breaking the code, and Stan had the other half.
You know, I think the frustration of DC Comics and the balls of Stan basically is what did it. But I would have to give credit to Stan. Stan was the one who ballsed it through. I think I did it first, but it just sat there. Stan was able to push it.
Yeah.
And he was perfectly right, and of course I was perfectly right. It was a non-issue. It was baloney because we had gone past the days of the Comics Code. It shouldn't have existed anymore. Just that those kinds of things hang out until something happens to get rid of them. Everything in society, it seems to me, hangs out way past its time. It just sits around and festers and turns to crap on you while everything moves on. And nobody gets up and says, hey, time to change this. Time to give the artists their artwork back. Time to pay royalties. Time to do those kinds of little things that should have been done 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I guess somebody's going to have to throw a stink grenade in the elevator before anybody's going to wake up.
Greetings, Earthlings. I am from the planet Zorton. Watch my friends, Denny's, Crenshaw, and Rick Osman, on unraveling the secrets, right here on the Soup Media Network each Saturday at midnight Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific, and each Sunday, at noon Eastern. They will bring you interesting guests and information from all over, above, or inside your pathetic little planet. Oh my. I've misplaced my tinfoil derby.
So, now we know that Neal was at least partly responsible for rewriting the Comics Code. Even though he didn't do the rewriting himself, he was part of the reason it was rewritten. We also know that Neal's not someone who easily takes no for an answer or gives up on much of anything that he starts. One of the things that we come to in part 3 of this series is we get away from the ancient history of Neal and his involvement in the comics industry, and we get into his more recent involvement and his more recent efforts to advance the state of the art within the comics industry, including his animatics projects, which you've seen some commercials for some unnamed products because I don't have their permission. But it involves a bee and some sneezing and a kind of a French accent. Anyway, that's Neal stuff, and it's pretty amazing stuff. So stick around for part 3, where we get into that a little bit more and how the industry is likely to change, partly in response to Mr. Neal Adams. So hope to see you for part 3. Thank you.